Start in just a second. For anyone who's getting food, we're gonna get started in just a second. Okay, good morning. Welcome to the Asheville City Council's Affordable Housing Work Session. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here and all the people that are joining us virtually for participating online. First, I just want to take a quick moment and have some introductions around the table. And if we can start with our city manager here, Deborah Campbell.
Deborah Campbell, serving the role as Asheville City Manager.
Keith Young, Asheville City Council.
Shanika Smith, Asheville City Council.
Brian Haynes, Asheville City Council.
Gwen Whistler, City Council.
Vijay Kapoor, City Council.
Julie Mayfield, City Council.
Brad Branham, City Attorney.
Richard White, Assistant City Manager.
Kathy Ball, Assistant City Manager.
Dion Nelson, Laurel Street Residential.
Hi, I'm Nikki Reed. I'm the city's Real Estate Program Director. Good morning.
Paul D'Angelo, Community Development Program Director.
And I'm Esther Manheimer, Mayor of the City of Asheville. And we also have a lot of staff here with us today. Staff, if you could stand up just so everyone can see you. Thank you, that's all I will require of your So we have invited a number of community partners in addition to the public to participate today, to be here with us during this work session. And community partners are over here. Hello, wave your hand, and members of the public. This is an opportunity for us to hear information about affordable housing. As you know, if you've been to a work session before, we don't take public comment during work sessions, but we will hear a lot of information. Asheville is a leader in terms of putting together policies that further affordable housing initiatives. We have other cities that actually come here and learn from us and our staff what the different tools are that we've developed around affordable housing. However, we have to do more, and we know that because for us, more than probably any other city in the state, this is one of our #1 issues. We have a special guest here today who already introduced herself, Dion Nelson. She is the president and CEO of Laurel Street. Dion is a for-profit developer of affordable housing, and she'll be providing the developer perspective, something she knows a lot about. Dion's experience includes creating 3,600 units of mixed-income housing totaling over $500 million of development across the Southeast. So thank you for being with us here today. We're eager to hear from you. So today's agenda is going to be a series of presentations, and it'll include presentations from staff as well as Dion. Before lunch, we will work on defining the affordable housing challenges and hear from Dion as well. And then we will take a short break and have a working lunch. And that's where we'll discuss the city's role in affordable housing. And then the staff we'll try to conclude here with the staff seeking policy direction from the city council to take further action on at a later date. So before we get started, our usual housekeeping items, everyone please silence your cell phones. And the restrooms are outside to the right. And we hope to conclude today's work session by 1 o'clock. And now I'm going to turn it over to the city manager, Deborah Campbell.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Good morning.
Good morning.
As the mayor said, we are going to provide you with a lot of information, but I assure you, particularly for council, this is a work session. After each presentation, we will have time for discussion. And as the mayor said, after lunch, we will go into a deeper dive in terms of our youth, looking at our existing tools, and we will be seeking and asking for policy direction on some things as we have analyze and assess some of the policies, some of the tools, and even some of the future needs for us to get policy direction from you all on next steps as it relates to, again, as the mayor said, this critical issue, not only for Asheville, but for our country. Many communities are faced with this challenge. We're going to start with presentations by Paul D'Angelo and Nikki Reed, and they're going to tag team. And the first part of the presentation is really going to be about kind of level setting, getting an understanding of what are the challenges that our community faces as it relates to addressing the issue of affordable housing. And with that, I will turn it over to Paul, starting out.
Yeah. Good morning. Thank you so much. We were asked quickly by our CAPE team, communication and public engagement team, to remind everybody that we are streaming live on YouTube and that you can find the link to the workshop's agenda and presentation in the video's presentation description, as well as on the city's affordable housing website. So good morning. We often hear from the city manager's office that you just kind of start with the end, hence this first slide, that affordable housing is hard and complicated, and something hopefully as we walk through presentations today, we'll be talking about solutions and some policy discussion that will lead us to maybe make that less difficult and less complicated. And when it boils down, a lot of things with affordable housing, it has to do with the numbers. And that's not just the numbers for the developer, but that's also making the numbers work for the city of Asheville, making the numbers work for our partners that are at the table, making the numbers work for the bank and the folks that loan the money, as well as making the numbers work for the individuals and families in our community who are looking for affordable housing. So the story is somewhat short, but there's a real mismatch in the city of Asheville, like in other places across the country, where we have lower wages but higher housing costs. It's also a supply and demand issue where we have a low supply of housing, particularly in home prices under $300,000, rent prices under $800, but a high demand for that pricing for affordable housing. So we always go to our HUD definition, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, to describe what is affordable housing. Households, both rental and home ownership, should spend no more than 30% of their gross income on housing. If you're a renter, this includes your rent and utilities. If you're a homeowner, this would include your mortgage, insurance, and taxes. And the more money that folks spend on housing, the less they have to spend on life's other necessities like food, clothing, transportation, as well as funds to support your local economy. And when we're talking about who is struggling with affordable housing, it's our cost burden individuals, the folks that are spending more than 30% of their gross income on housing. If you're spending more than 30% on housing, you are cost burdened. If you are spending more than 50% of your gross income on housing, you are severely cost burdened. And the Bowen Report, which is our housing needs assessment that we update every 2 years and do a larger study on every 5 years. For Asheville-Buncombe County, we have a recent update. Nearly half of our renters are cost burdened, meaning they're spending more than 30% of their costs on housing, and about 1 in every 5 owners is cost burdened. When it comes to renters being severely cost burdened, spending more than 50%, that's about 1 in 5, where about 1 in 8 of our homeowners are severely cost burdened. And again, not just an Asheville problem. Our departments take a good look at some of the research that comes out, especially in the summertime, from the Joint Center for Housing Studies from Harvard, as well as the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. There is nowhere in the United States where a worker can earn a minimum wage working full-time where they can afford a 2-bedroom home at fair market rent. And that includes communities where the minimum wage is higher than the national $7.25. It could be $10 or $12 an hour. There's nowhere in the U.S. where a worker can do that. And there's only 28 counties nationwide out of the 3,000 plus counties where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford a 1-bedroom rental home at fair market rent. Again, anywhere in the country and in places where the minimum wage is at $10 or $12 an hour. U.S. construction is not keeping pace with demand, so supply and demand issue. There's a lack of supply and a high demand, you're going to see rising costs. And also very interesting, but something that makes us nervous, you're definitely seeing the housing cost burden issues creep into the middle incomes. So normally these reports, you see folks struggling at the $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 household income. Now you're seeing cost burdens creeping up to the $60,000, $70,000, $75,000 wages where they're becoming housing cost burdened. And in Buncombe County, a minimum wage worker would need to work 85 hours per week to afford a modest one-bedroom apartment here in Buncombe County, City of Asheville. So when we're talking about who we're working with, who's cost burdened, these are the area median incomes published by HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, every spring. And mostly we're looking at the low to moderate wages at 80% AMI or below is typically where we see affordable housing. And typically these are the households, 1, 2, 3, 4-person households that are cost burdened. So if you're looking at the left-hand column at the 30% AMI with one person, $13,950, you're talking about someone on a fixed income, Social Security, perhaps disability, SSI. If you're looking at the second column at 50% AMI, a two-person household at $26,600, that could be one full-time worker at minimum wage and another part-time worker minimum wage in a household, and their combined wages would be $26,600, and that is a 50% AMI where they're going to be struggling. And up the chart with 60% AMI at $35,850 for a three-person household, that could be two working folks, one making about $16 an hour, one making minimum wage, and they would fall into that category. So those are the individuals and families that we're really concentrating on that are cost burdened.
Can you remind us what that area median income number is for Asheville, Buncombe County?
Sure, if you look at the single figure, what HUD.
Oh, so you go all the way to the end.
Right. So if people say, what's the area median income when it comes to the city of Asheville, they would say $66,400. They'll base it on 100% AMI for a family of four. Last year it was at, I think, $61,300, about a $5,000 bump this year, and that with some rising wages, but still struggling with those housing costs. So beyond this area median income, we also try to deep dive into Asheville figures. And so we took a look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, American Community Surveys, the National Low Income Housing Coalition to try to get an idea of what the average wage is here. And we come across to where it's about $40,000 is the average annual salary. And that matches with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a heating and air tech, making about $19.14 an hour. And on that salary of approximately $40,000, they would have $995 to spend per month on housing. And a reminder that that salary could be supporting a family of 1, 2, 3, or 4. And if they're renting, that $995 would need to cover rent and utilities. If they're a homeowner, it would need to cover the mortgage, insurance, and taxes. So taking a look at what that housing wage can cover, what the average housing costs are in Asheville, as well as the gap, if you take a look at that renter, the average rent in Asheville coming across the board comes in at about $1,150, and based on what they could afford with that $995 and whether their rent covers utilities or not, you're looking at an approximately $317 household gap. So they would be be cost burdened by spending that much more on rent above what they could actually afford.
And Paul, that 1150 number, that's an average across one bedroom, three bedroom.
Correct.
So that's
multifamily and some single
That's
family,
just
yes.
multi-family. Okay.
And then when it comes to if you are a homeowner and at $40,000 you had $995 to spend on housing, the median housing cost in 2018 in Asheville, Buncombe County came in at $310,000. So the mortgage for that, if you were lucky enough to put down $62,000 to avoid PMI, private market insurance, that would cost you $1,653 a month. So an individual of $40,000 a year would not be able to afford that house, and if they did, they would be spending $658 above what they really should be spending on housing. So they would most likely be severely cost burdened, and it shows that mismatch between wages and our housing costs and the averages. So looking at that salary for our heating and air technician at $40,000 per year, again, supporting an individual or family, this community member could afford a home priced at $135,000 with no money down, or again, if they're lucky enough to put down 20%, they could afford a house at $170,000. And I'm sure, as everybody knows, our housing stock at that level really doesn't exist. And I'm going to turn it over to Nikki Reed.
So I think that's where we wanted to go next. So Paul's really outlined some of the challenges that we have from from our buyer side, from our household side, in terms of the median incomes and what people can afford based off of the HUD definition of what's affordable. Now we turn to try to understand what's going on in our housing market. So we pulled this graph to take a look at how the median home sale price has changed over time, because it tells a story. So we see how the city of Asheville, our price, median home price, is shown there in red, and we see the Buncombe County home price shown there in blue. And this chart really starts 2003, ends in the first quarter of 2019. And what we see is that in the beginning in 2003 in the city of Asheville, the median home price was $148,000. And then we see the kind of slight dip after the recession, even though the home prices continued to rise. That slight dip and then a rapid recovery. And now we're at the point where in 2018, at the highest point there on the graph, the median home price in the city of Asheville is $310,000. So if we look at, again, using our wage of the HVAC tech, we see that pretty much they were priced out of the market in 2004. Now, we look again deeper at actually what's on the market right now.
I'm sorry, Nikki, could you just go back really quick?
You bet.
Just one quick question, one quick point. It's interesting here that looks like between 2003 and 2009, Buncombe County, not Asheville, was actually, the sale price was actually higher than the city of Asheville. And it looks like that flipped in 2012, but at this point, it looks like, I mean, for our purposes, looking at this, the sale price is almost the same right now.
It's getting
Right,
pretty
for
close.
both for in the county and the city of Asheville. So obviously, we're talking about this as the city of Asheville. There's also probably another partner here in Buncombe County who will also probably be at the table at some point.
Absolutely.
And other cities, not just Buncombe County, but other cities and towns in Buncombe County.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so this is actually the housing market for the entire of Buncombe County, the entirety of Buncombe County. So we wanted to show basically the breakdown. If you were a buyer on the market today, going into MLS, working with a realtor, this is what's the housing stock that we have on the market today. And this is homes, of course, so ownership here. But we're seeing, at the 200, 299, we have 214 homes for sale on the market. And again, when we compare that to 2014, there were a lot more homes that were within that affordable reach versus today. And we do see that there is greater supply in these higher brackets as well. The other notable point here is that we actually tried to zero in on the availability of homes in the Asheville city limits also, where only 48 homes are currently listed under $275,000. So we're seeing now how the supply side is starting to bend towards the higher incomes as well. So it's notable, right? But again, I think this now shows how wages and home prices have changed over time. And so kind of bringing both sides together, what we're seeing here with this graph is that in 1967, we look at the median wage there, $45,000.
What is this for?
This is nationwide.
Nationwide, okay.
This is nationwide because it is a national problem. And so looking at 1967, we saw that the price of housing and the incomes were 2.5 times difference there. So we have the 45,000 median household income with a home price around 114,000. But then over time, we've seen that divide grow, where again, the wages have somewhat stagnated, but at the same time, housing costs have skyrocketed, right? So we're seeing now in Asheville, other markets, where the housing cost is 5 times or greater than the median salary. So Paul pointed out earlier that our average median wage, and this is back in 2017, we wanted to make sure to benchmark that. But in 2017, our local 100% AMI for a family of 4 is $61,000, and there's that home price again. So it's starting to really become something out of reach for our average wages here in Asheville. So in summary, what we're seeing, just to summarize, is we have this gap. We have lower wages in Asheville, but we have a very high housing cost. And we recognize that the city has a limited influence on the income side. And we'll certainly talk about the city's influence later on today. But then we wanted to call in the supply and demand issue, that we see that not enough units are being added to the market, specifically in the affordable pricing points. And we have strong demand here in Asheville. There's a strong demand for housing, so that puts pressure on pricing as well. And what we're seeing is that the lowest income earners are the most cost burdened. The need cuts across all income levels below the 80% AMI, but we have a lot of need. Our moderate and low income households are being priced out of the market. So another thing that we keep in mind as we look at how our role takes effect is understanding that the lower AMI level, the higher the subsidy. Okay. Any questions at this point or any discussion? All right.
And I know that the information that was presented is probably, you all are saying, duh, yeah, we knew that. But I think when you actually see the numbers and see the challenge in terms of what has happened historically, we have to understand the complexity of this issue and that there is no one solution to addressing this issue. It is extremely complicated and it takes lots of resources, lots of partners, and quite frankly, time to address it. And I know that we hear a lot, we don't have enough time, we don't have the time. But it is an issue that certainly we need to focus, put all of our attention from a community perspective, not just from a city and local government perspective, but a community perspective.
Okay, so in summary, the problem is a gap. So most of our wages in Asheville don't support our average housing costs. This is both in rental and homeownership. So we're looking at a market problem, right, that's ultimately in search of a community solution. And that's why we're here today, right? This is the vision for housing that is based off of council's strategic vision, is that we have an equitable, inclusive, mixed income community with a variety of housing types at a variety of price points, both homeownership and rental, for the variety of wages and incomes we produce in Asheville. So this is what we're pinning our vision to, that's based upon the council's strategic vision. And this is where we're headed today in terms of our discussion. Paul, you want to speak?
Sure, and one of our big challenges to delivering affordable housing, it has to do with if we're working with our cost-burdened individuals and families below 30 to 60, below 80, that comes with a subsidy beyond the build cost, to where if we're asking a developer, mission-driven nonprofit, anyone, there's a gap there, a subsidy needed to be able to make that lower rent number work for the developer and the bank and their partners. And so for below 30% area median income, that gap could be up to $120,000 needed to make that happen. Usually, again, for like an up to 20-year rental product. Between 30 and 60, that gap could be up to $100,000 per unit. And at 80% AMI, that gap could be up to $80,000 per unit. And so if someone is talking about maybe adding 10 units at 30 to 60 AMI, that could be $1 million request somewhere, some subsidy that has to come from somewhere. If it's us alone, as Deborah pointed out, that's a lot of resources, but with the partners, we could possibly fill that gap, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
So we wanted to start to pivot here to really unpack the challenges about delivering the housing, delivering the affordable housing to the market. And so when we wanted to break this down, we referenced the 2019 Urban Land Institute. So they sent out a survey nationwide to developers of housing asking, what is it about housing that makes it so complicated? And some of these things really get at the issues beyond land costs, beyond just putting the deal together, it really started to pick apart the nuance associated with development. So the first here is the cost of capital. So this is the cost, the interest on a bank loan, right? That cost is something that is difficult to overcome to produce those affordable units. The lack of building efficiencies. This is not a factory product that comes off the line. When you show up on a job site, it's basically a new project every time. When we think about the availability of buyer financing, that was also cited, cost of materials, lack of industry leadership, lack of density, NIMBYism, local government regulations and fees, and then land prices and availability being the other issue. When we then asked our community to respond to that, to say, tell us of this list, what your experience is here locally, we got these priority areas. So as you can see there, number one is that land price and availability. Not too surprising, given our topography and the constraints of our area here. Number two was cost of materials. Number three, local government regulation and fees. Number four, cost of capital, financing costs. So when we wanted to come today to speak with you about, as policymakers, where we could make an impact, we looked at those, and apart from cost of materials, felt that there could be policies in place that could function within those problem areas, right? So we have the ability as a city to use our city land to make it available for housing. We act as a lender, so we can assist with the cost of capital issue. We are local government, so we can talk about our regulations and fees and how to improve those items. So that's what we're going to dive deep on later this morning.
And if I can just jump in with a couple numbers here, when you're looking at land prices in the city of Asheville, you're talking an acre close to the central business district. We're seeing prices push nearly $2 million an acre, close to the central business district. We've been watching housing costs, of course, like over the last couple of years, we've seen about a 35 to 40% increase on your all-in build. So if you've got a super efficient all-in house builder, traditional rental, 3-story garden style walk-up. They used to be able to do something like that about 3 years ago for, again, super efficient $98,000. That price right now is coming in at about $140,000, $1,000 per the unit being built. Most of the developers come in for an apartment like that at about $165,000. A tax credit might come on at $185,000. Those prices, we're seeing continued pressure with the cost of materials. Again, about a 40% increase over the last 2.5, 3 years.
So again, I think this was where we want to focus later today, is thinking about the city's role in funding, the city's role in city-owned land, the city's role in regulatory. And to summarize, we can understand the development constraints. We can recognize that the lower AMI levels require higher subsidies. And then now, once we fully understand how affordable housing is developed, what it takes to develop affordable housing, then we can design policies to make an impact. Yes.
One other question is, in terms of, so on the prior slide, we talked about the challenges you got from the ULI. Can you talk a little bit about just the number of entities who actually do this as well, in terms of actually do affordable housing? Like,
In Asheville.
In Asheville, like do we, relative to other cities, and again, I'm sort of in an Asheville bubble, I'm looking at Deborah who's in Charlotte, but do we, in terms of what we see in Asheville, do we have sort of fewer entities that do these relative to other places? So fewer groups that are actually developing affordable housing?
Private development.
Right.
Yes, definitely compared to other cities, we do. We've got some good partners here on the ground. Of course, Mountain Housing Opportunity, Habitat for Humanity, the Housing Authority with the Lee Walker Heights and what they're doing with their partners. But outside of some of our regular partners, we get interest from tax credit developers here and there. We see a tax credit, 9% tax credit award in the city of Asheville, about one every 3 years. Buncombe County gets one about every other year. So we do have a couple tax credit developers that like to work in this area, but the challenge of cost and topography, often tax credit developers tell me that they can't make the numbers work for a tax credit development. Outside of that, part of my mission when I was first brought on with the city was to do that regional tour of developers. So talking about this with Deborah yesterday, we've met a lot of developers in the for-profit, tax credit developers, mission-driven developers who have an interest in working here, but We haven't seen that actually drop to where they're actually partnering with us or other entities to actually start building units. There's a strong interest there. I think they're waiting to see where our policies lead, if there are some partners and incentives that will actually make the Asheville market more attractive in the sense of making the numbers work.
And so, Paul, in terms of what you heard from them, are the same questions for those folks who aren't deciding to come here, the same things we see over here, the 1 through 4?
Yes.
And so same issues. If we're looking, if part of our focus is, look, we want to get some more folks to come in here and enter our market, it's the same issues of folks who are already here, right? These 1 through 4.
Yep, and then if you could find a way to just flatten all the land.
Let's not actually do that. That would be a terrible idea.
Totally.
Paul,
Just some, not all.
and I'm not going to remember the numbers, but I think I generally remember this, that we've actually gotten more affordable units built by non-mission driven developers than the mission-driven developers. Is that right? So like people, developers setting aside, 20% of units in a multifamily development. Is that right?
We are working through the numbers for the last 5 years to really kind of take a deeper dive into the number of units that have truly been, with us as partners, have been built, whether that includes financial or incentives. But I do think with the conditional zoning, there has been a nice level of units that have come out of city council that way versus the mission-driven tax credit developers on hand. But I think that they are still more in that arena versus the conditional zoning.
Okay. I guess the point though is that is another important source of affordable housing for us, is affordable housing that is built into market rate housing and is put in there as a condition of their approval.
Right, and we did take a look, I think we talked about this at council, where we did take a look at, over the last 4 years, if our for-profit developers had done 20% of their units at a level of affordability below 80%, we'd have nearly 400 additional units if more of those for-profit developers were doing 20% of their units at affordable. So, getting all the developers at the table, very important, so that everyone's doing their part.
Okay. So I think at this point, we're going to transition. So really to lead into the discussion that Dion is going to share, it's really about understanding what it takes to develop and build affordable housing and understanding all the moving parts. And so with that, Deborah.
Okay, and I just want to make sure, because we're doing really well on time, just to make sure that there weren't any additional questions from council regarding what we've just covered.
Well, yeah, this is sort of a question, I guess. So of these three things, land availability, cost of capital, and government regulations, there's one that we clearly are in charge of, right? Government regulations. I mean, we're not in charge of all of those, but we're certainly in charge of a lot of them. The other two, the cost of capital, we can't really do anything about banks, but we can influence that by putting money on the table, right? And then on the land and availability, again, we can't really do anything about, what we can do about that is around zoning and then also using our own land, right?
Correct.
So our levers in each of these three buckets is very different. But we do have, there is something we can do in each of these buckets.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And when we get to the discussion around the policy direction, we're going to address most of those
Right.
issues. Obviously, a little bit in terms of cost of capital, where we have control over the loan program. And I don't know that we actually have any request for a different direction on any of our actual loan programs, but we'll be talking in detail about next steps. So at this point, I think I can introduce a person that I have known for several years, Ms. Dion Nelson, who you have heard, she's president and CEO of Laurel Street Residential. This is a mixed income development company located in Charlotte, North Carolina. Dion has over 25 years of experience in real estate development, finance, and operations. I had the great pleasure of serving with her when I was the planning director. She was a part of the planning commission in Charlotte. and worked with her on a number of committees related to the Urban Land Institute. And I think you heard Paul mention a couple of times about mission-driven developers. This is definitely one that is mission-driven. I think former employment was with Crosland Development Company, for-profit development company, but still her emphasis was related to the delivery of affordable housing. And so with that, I guess I would sum up by saying, quite frankly, she is one of the most smartest people I know. So I'll turn it over to Dion, especially in the arena of affordable housing.
Well, thank you all for having me. I appreciate the time to share with you. I think it's actually notable that you all have gathered to spend this much time on this topic, right? It's very complex, and but your investment is worth noting. I'm going to spend a few minutes just to give you a little bit more background on kind of what we actually do as a company, and then talk more about doing this work from the developer's perspective. But I'd like it to be a dialogue. So if you have a question, hopefully I don't have my developer horns on. Everybody thinks all developers are bad. I'd like to think that's not true, but you tell me if I'm wrong. Help me a little bit. Uh-oh.
And that's it.
Skip? There, let's try it again.
Oh, making it go.
There we go. Okay. Very good. Okay, so Laurel Street develops mixed income, and I describe myself as a mixed income housing developer. And by that, I use that word intentionally. For one, the word affordable brings its own baggage, right? And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes that's not. It depends on the constituency that you're talking to. But our priority is really thinking about mixed income communities and thinking about developing communities. Everything we develop has some layer of affordability. So nothing we do will ever be top of market 100%. But how we mix that income, at what depth of income, who we're serving really does vary from project to project. As Ms. Deborah mentioned, we are based in Charlotte, but we've developed across the Southeast from Atlanta to Richmond. We are in our 8th year of operations, having developed Laurel Street after Crosland exited the development business. We are really a small team. We do a lot of work, but we are today a team of 14 professionals, well known from a reputation perspective for being a partner type of developer. So you see us doing work with other developers, municipalities, housing authorities, CDCs, and even in the recent few years, we've done more work with faith-based institutions than we have in our historical path. So we are really seeing all members of the community come to the table to collaborate and come up with solutions, and we enjoy doing that work. We are a certified MWBE business based on my ownership as the managing partner. From a portfolio perspective, 3,600 units in our development portfolio, $500 million worth of development, including both affordable and workforce. So the distinction I'm going to make here is going to be in how those deals are financed. Affordable, generally, when I use that term, I'm talking about a tax credit development that is targeting households with an average income of 60% AMI or less. Workforce housing has a more of a market-like structure, but includes units targeted generally at 80% of AMI or less. Our portfolio is about 2/3, 1/3, not by structure, but by kind of happenstance. About 1,000 of our units are for seniors, meaning age restricted at 55 and above, and the other 2/3 for families without an age restricted. So families generally meaning not age restricted. So in terms of type of products, again, I want to distinguish affordable and middle income. Sometimes I cross-reference that word and I use workforce. But the key to the difference is how we financed it. A tax credit deal is gonna be more deeply affordable because you have the leverage of the tax credit subsidy to allow you to reach those 30% AMI units, 50% AMI units, 60% AMI units. On the middle income and workforce housing, we're one of few developers who have really tried to push to figure out how do you serve the middle income household. And it's really challenging, but it is a conventional structure. So we're using private equity and a conventional debt structure. In both of those buckets, we have age-restricted products, so we have a middle-income seniors. So we're trying to figure out where does the retired teacher live in this market, right? I use my mother as the example, who was over income. She's a career teacher. She was over income for a tax credit deal, but could not afford to buy into the typical retirement CCRC type of community. But also we do senior housing for tax credit. Non-age restricted in both buckets. New construction is what I'm gonna primarily focus on today, but I think the other piece of this puzzle is preservation. It is rehab. Because what I'm seeing in a lot of cities is you're actually losing your existing stock. So if you have a problem today, it's like having a hole in the bottom of the bucket. You're trying to pour more water in the bucket, but if every year you're losing more of those old, typically older apartments, C-class apartments that are now being bought by usually national private equity firms. They come in, they put in some granite and stainless steel appliances, and they take the popcorn ceilings out, and they raise your rents by 25%. You now have lost some number of units that you had at some point in the past. So both, I think, are important. And I'm not doing this slide thing right, okay. So in terms of the developer's perspective, what is the role of a developer? I would describe our role as we believe that our job is to create places. Places that we live, places that we work, places where we play. So as a residential developer, my priority is to focus on creating places where people can live. As a mixed income housing developer, I would add the layer of, for us, for Laurel Street, that would be creating places where we live, where a percentage of our units are affordable to people who make less than the median income. I often say this to people when they ask me, what do I actually do? We're a glorified project manager, right? My job is to figure out how do I get it from an idea, drive down the street, I see a raw land, I pass a patch of grass. How do I get from that concept to not only a development where people can live, but one that will operate sustainably and profitably in the long term? Because that's important in order to attract the capital to deliver the building. We assume and manage the risk at every stage of execution, and we expect to get paid for that risk that we've assumed in order to deliver the successful operation. How are our focus areas and priorities different? For a mixed income affordable housing developer, we do have the priority and expectation to make a reasonable return, but it's generally dictated by our partners and our investors. So in a tax credit deal, the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency literally tells you what the developer fee can be per unit. And I would add, North Carolina is a low developer fee state. We make more money on the same project in Georgia and in Virginia than we would on that same deal in North Carolina. But we will comply with what NCHFA dictates, and that will be our fee. Typically in an affordable deal, your fee is mainly fee-based. What the money made is mainly fee-based. It is not tied to upside. Because for all practical purposes, by the definition of restricting unit revenue, you're limiting the amount of profit in that deal. So the upside is much more constrained, right? Yes, there's some asset management fee over the long term. There's small nuggets of income streams that go with tax credit development over the long term. But for all practical purposes, it's very limited. So you make the bulk of the dollars on the upfront during the development and construction process. But for us, we also have to minimize our risk. Because there is limited upside, you don't have the capacity to absorb losses the way a market rate developer might be able to absorb losses. So it's very important for us to come up with a model that works execute it, and get it right. If I get burned by a bad contractor, it is very costly. I have had deals where we deferred our entire fee to dig ourselves out of a hole. But you couldn't replicate that. You couldn't do that more than once because the fee is so thin. And the other key for us is community impact. Why do we do what we do? It's kind of the same concept of why does a teacher teach, right? We do this work because I love this work. I was sharing this is the best job I've ever had. And without the altruistic piece, to me, it wouldn't be the same. Market rate developers are also trying to create a place. They make their return primarily based on upside. So when we structure a conventionally financed deal, our developer fee is generally less than in a tax credit deal. Same 100 units, my investor in a conventionally structured deal is gonna tell me I can earn less developer fee during construction. But they're gonna give me this little bogey that says, but if you structure a deal that beats our return expectation, you get a bigger chunk of that. So they're incentivizing me to not only meet their return expectation, but exceed their return expectation. And I need to exceed their return expectation in order to have been compensated reasonably. But there's also increased complexity. The work that we do, we tend to develop the same model, both conventionally and in tax credit world, meaning we're gonna build stick-built construction, surface parked. I like a flat lot too. I mean, we're trying to keep it simple because we're trying to manage our costs because we are constantly trying to figure out how to layer in the affordability. Your typical market rate developer is building a larger multifamily complex. So I might build 100 to 150 units. Most market rate developers want to build 300 units. They would say 100 is too small. They are going to build structured parking, tighter lot, steel, concrete construction, high rise, et cetera. But as those complexities enter the conversation, so does the risk. And so the key to market rate development is you take on greater risk and you expect to be compensated for that increased risk. And therefore, they're gonna make more money on their deal than we would make on an affordable deal.
And I would add just on that, we've seen some spin out on that here. We recently had the Fuddruckers proposal for 300 units, I believe, somewhere around that, and that was with an internal parking structure, and the deal collapsed. So we're having a hard time, it seems like, getting, we have some, but the more what you're talking about, stick-built, surface lot, keeping at what you can't go over 4 stories, right, with that under the North Carolina Building Code. That's kind of what we see a little more revving in our city.
Makes sense, and I'm gonna touch on that a little bit more in a minute.
Just one other question on the,
Sure.
on the North Carolina, you mentioned this, they were a low developer fee state, right?
Yes.
Up in the tax credit, as it relates to tax credits. Do those amounts differ between cities? Like,
No.
is that flat? So Asheville is the same as Charlotte, it's the same as, Brunswick County? It's
Correct.
all of them.
Correct. It's a per unit dollar amount allowed, up to a cap per project. And I think it's 1.1 million per project, 13,000 a unit per unit. But you basically do the math. You don't make any more money to build more than X number of units. At some point, you can build 150 units if you want, but it's the same fee.
And do you see that as being kind of a disincentive for a lot of folks to enter this particular market?
The North Carolina.
No, I think North Carolina is an attractive market. It has historically been a relatively incestuous market, meaning years ago, it was very difficult for an out-of-state developer to become qualified to do tax credit development in North Carolina. That has loosened over the years, and so you're seeing more people chasing deals. But I do think, for example, the 9% rounds are so competitive that a lot of developers, frankly, don't really want the heartache and the brain damage to do it. The way we compete on 9%, it's a point system, right? But if you look at it, everything that won was within 1 point of the whole. There's a 1 point differential in the whole win list. and there's a point category that is a guess. And you have to guess at what the average credit request from the state is going to be per unit. And if you're within 4% of the average of the current applications, not last year's applications, you get the max points, you get 2 points. If you're within more than 4 but less than 8, you get 1 point. You win and lose over one line categories in North Carolina. Does that make sense? But I am guessing what the current credit request is gonna be for this round. So we put in 9% applications too this year. We didn't win, we guessed wrong. Okay, right? So we take that heartburn, but you only get beat up so many times before you just say, whatever, I can go to Atlanta and do a 4% deal and keep it moving, right? Because it's the same workload, right? 4% are not competitive from the state level. You do have to meet certain threshold requirements, but they are very costly in terms of subsidy. So we only pursue 4% tax credit deals in the municipalities that can write a big enough check, right? On average, we need $4 to $5 million of subsidy per 4% transaction. So we're doing them in Charlotte, we're gonna do them in Durham, we're doing them in, very specific situations. And so that's why where you all land from a policy perspective in terms of what funds are available will make or break whether or not developers actively pursue this market. I will say this though, developers chase the rules. So if you set reasonable rules, I promise you the development community will come.
Well, and so to highlight that here again in Asheville, we're partnering with the Housing Authority to redevelop our first public housing neighborhood, our oldest public housing neighborhood, Lee Walker. And we lost the 9%. I mean, I say we because we're
Collectively,
working with the
yes.
Housing Authority. And we had to go with the 4%. As you mentioned, it's not competitive. I mean, it was a question of, do we keep trying and wait? Or do we go for a known quantity? We could do the 4%, but the public subsidy of that project is 8.4 million between the city and the county. Significant per unit subsidy to make that a possibility.
Correct.
Just from the perspective of the state, so if we were to argue to legislators, look, expand the number of units, expand the number of entities that could qualify for the 9%. From the perspective of the state, is what they're essentially losing the tax revenue? It's essentially tax revenue? Is that kind of what the state would be losing?
No, so the program is a federal program, is IRS Code Section 42. It's a federal program that allocates tax credits to each state based on the per capita. And then every state has an agency that sets a qualified allocation plan, or what we call the QAP, which is our rule book, to say, how does that state then distribute those tax credits? And so in North Carolina, they have a regional system and then a county system as to how much you all will compete in metro. So you're going head to head against Wake, Cumberland, Mecklenburg, Guilford, et cetera, right? And that makes a difference. And some cities have gotten very sophisticated about how to get their fair share. Charlotte spent a lot of time a few years ago figuring out why are we not getting our fair share? And it was because they were cherry picking deals. And so the deals that the council liked may not have been the deals that got the perfect score. And if they were eliminating too many deals before they sent them to the state, oops, we picked the wrong ones, now you didn't get your fair share. So they finally figured it out and said, we're basically gonna award almost anything that comes through and let the state pick its favorites, with the assumption being, if you really look at the state's criteria on a 9% deal, it is so stiff. The odds that you get a bad deal out of 9% round, to me, is almost inconceivable. Right? But if you only sent one, or if you've narrowed it to the point without really being in the weeds about how that score is gonna come out, you're right, you may miss. And they're gonna rank the region from high score to low score across, and every county has a cap. And you take the highest score until that county runs out. It's a very complicated scoring system. The bottom line is, We know the rules, we'll follow the rules. I don't think your issue is a developer capacity or a developer interest in Asheville issue. I think it's about policy and whether or not we see our way to how to make a deal work. If we can combine the state's policies and programs with your policies and programs, and it makes sense in terms of deal execution, you will get more developer interest. In terms of risk, I wanted to share. So I'm sharing from a mixed income, affordable housing development perspective. What we have on the table, the skin that we have to put in the game to even try to do this work. One would be developer overhead and operating costs. And this is my number. When I look at my team, and we close probably 4 or 5 projects a year, the level of overhead that I have to carry to do this work is about $500,000 per project per year. So not getting something closed or having a deal fall apart is very expensive for us because we've carried it and now there's no revenue to offset it. The thing that keeps me up at night, again, we're for-profit. People look at that through one lens, which means we're making a profit about affordable housing. Yes, we are, based on a regulated developer fee number. But the flip side of that is I have payroll next month, and it's not insignificant. So I have to be efficient, and we have to produce in order to continue to do this work. Pursuit costs. Pursuit is what I describe as from a concept to having the basics in place to move forward, meaning entitlements, a belief that we could put together a capital stack. We spend up to $100,000 per project concept just to figure out if we have a real deal. So if I may be frank, when we get to the council meeting and somebody retrades my zoning at the 11th hour, the pain point of that is significant, right? We've been through all the community meetings, we've complied, we've agreed, we talked to the staff, we agreed with planning, we talked to the transportation people, we figured it all out. And at the 11th and a half hour, somebody says, oh, by the way, could you do this instead of this and this and that? In our world, that doesn't work, right? Because I can't carry that, and at some point that trade breaks the deal. Pre-development costs. So now I've got entitlements. I believe I have my financing in place, or I've won the tax credits, or I've gotten a commitment from an equity provider, but now I have to close. So from the day I have my financing in place to the day we close, we front $500,000 to $650,000 per project of capital that we have to finance as a company in order to get to the closing table. Now, those costs are project costs. We get reimbursed, but you have to be able to carry it.
Can I ask you a question back
Sure.
on the pursuit costs? So, you know, in Asheville, we what comes before city council usually comes to us in the form of a conditional zoning application. And so the city council does make 11:30. 11:59. We make demands at the council level, and I think developers that come through the Asheville City Council know to expect that, and often try to meet with all of us ahead of time because they can under the CZ application process. But one thing I've noticed is a thing that happens, and it's always been the case. You'll stuff in these last minute demands, and they can be significant. I mean, we had a hotel project approved across the street from our own Lee Walker project that agreed to $650,000 worth of Affordable Housing Trust Fund contributions and playground, to build the playground in the new Lee Walker development. And some of those that have made these significant concessions have gone ahead and their projects are moving forward. Some of them are dirt. They're still just dirt. And my concern is that they weren't able to finish on the back end.
Correct.
I don't know if it's what we required them to do at that 11th hour or if it's the project itself, but there's nothing coming out of the ground.
I believe it's a combination thereof. But in particular, in the affordable housing world, where the margin is really razor thin, where we have a total development cost and we've cobbled together the sources to cover those total development costs, and there isn't an extra X percent, then that trade at the 11th hour is more likely to break the deal. And when I've been on the other side of that, when you're standing at the podium, you're inclined to say yes, right? But the reality is you may not be able to deliver and execute it. It's also a time issue for affordable housing developers. So let's say you ask for something that I'm really hesitant that I could actually deliver, but I also have a clock ticking because I have to have my zoning in order to submit my full application for tax credits and so on and so on and so on. So I think the win, if you're really trying to support affordable housing and mixed income housing development, is figuring out how to structure your ask into your policy. Like 9 times out of 10, if I knew that was what you really wanted, I would have either tried to build it in up front and maybe made different choices. And to be honest, I might make a different choice at the community meeting when they want more brick. No, you can't have more brick because city council is making me do 20% at whatever, right? Those are the trade-offs I need to be, but I need to be able to make it and be able to go back to my office and run my spreadsheet and make sure it ticks and ties before we sign on the dotted line.
So you need certainty.
Yes.
Certainty earlier in the
Upfront.
process.
Yes, early in the process, if it's a part of your policy, then we can work with you to try to deliver it. But at some point, that's it.
I mean, but, and that's something maybe you can help us out with. I think there's a lot of times the community kind of doesn't believe there's a that's it moment. There's this, you said you put the developer's horns or take the developer's horns off. I think in our community, and I suspect in a lot of communities, there's this idea of, well, you guys are making so much money that you can do X. And it would be interesting to hear, how are other communities dealing with that? I mean, is it a matter of more transparencies, that people just need to see the numbers? But how do you deal with that kind of, people don't believe that you're not just making it hand over fist. I mean, at least that's my sense
I think that's fair. I think that's part of the reputation of the real estate industry. But I'm gonna get to that in 2 seconds in terms of where we get to the that's it moment. Was there another, I thought I saw another reaction.
I just wanted to make the point that, I think if state law were clear that we could do inclusionary zoning and
Sure.
make those rules make those expectations really clear, I think we would do it. But
Sure.
that is not the case. So.
I agree with that, and I like inclusionary zoning. What that would do for you, or us across the state, is it levels the playing field. So most developers who develop, let's say in Charleston, right, where they do inclusionary zoning, all the market rate developers are doing the 5 or 8% affordable because they all are. But that makes the deal on this corner valued the same as this corner. Right now, you're gonna get a negative reaction from market rate developers because one got his zoning by right and doesn't have any affordable in it. And then the other one required a conditional zoning and you all, arm twisted a little bit and got something out of him. But now he has to sell his project. So each developer is now going to try to sell their project in the market. And one project is now worth less than the other project. So they're gonna resist because there is a perception that the playing field isn't even and it is gonna have a long-term effect on economics, right? With inclusionary zoning, everybody came down a notch, but it came down evenly across the entire industry. And until that is the case, then I think you're gonna struggle. I think when the requests are modest, most inclusionary zoning I've seen is between 5 and 8% inclusionary, right? When you're getting way beyond that, I think we're starting to question at what point does it break. Last couple of points on this slide, and I'm gonna get to what I think you all really wanna talk about. The other things to recognize that developers are putting into the deal is the guarantees. We guarantee construction completion that on a typical deal is up to $15 million. And we also have to put an operating guarantee on the deals which is generally up to $500,000 per project and burn off over some number of years in the future. So let's talk about affordable and mixed income housing a little bit more. Our goal here is to develop and preserve market rate quality housing and make it affordable to households. So I'm building a market rate unit, same cost, but I have to rent it for less. As Paul said, that's a math problem, right? He went through this, I'm not gonna rehash this in terms of incomes, but the ranges as you think about it, 1 to 3 bedroom in each of these categories, who are we trying to serve and who those people are, households are that are needing that support. What I thought was interesting when I really started to look at the numbers, so these are the rents that we could charge in each of the categories. 60% AMI, we can charge a 584 to 777. 80%, 833 to 1122. 100% AMI gets you to 1,082 to 1467. And then you see 120% AMI, which is 1331 to 1812. This is what would be affordable to a household in that range for a 1 to 3 bedroom unit. But your market rents are 1173 to, I would say, about 1820 for a 3 bedroom. So you effectively have to be 120% of AMI to afford market rate rent for a new construction unit in Asheville. So your middle income is truly suffering as well, in addition to your deeper affordability.
How does that compare to other places you've seen? Is this normal for North Carolina cities?
She's saying it dramatically, like it's.
I would say your situation is a little bit worse. So I would describe market rate rent in Charlotte. Maybe it's a little stronger, especially on that 1 bedroom end. But our income is higher.
Yeah.
So the affordability rent is actually higher. So we could probably get, off the top of my head, about 700 for a 1 bedroom up to pushing 1,000 on a 3 bedroom for 60% AMI unit. But our market, so the differential here actually seems bigger, which means when you ask that developer to put in, they're taking out, they're taking their model, they're pulling out a $1,500 a month unit and replacing it with $685. That hit on the numbers, let's go through it, it's gonna be dramatic. Why is that? Why are rents so high? Nikki hit on a lot of this. Supply and demand, all of us have underbuilt housing. And your housing, if you look at your population growth, you're starting at a deficit and you're still not building fast enough in order to keep up with the growth. We've had increased construction and development costs. I'm probably one of the few developers that you'll meet that will say, I'll be glad when there's a break in the market, right? But I'm an affordable housing developer. So we're gonna build through the recession. We built through the last one, we're gonna build through the next one, right? Our demand doesn't go away. So I'm not as spooked by the break in the market. What it does for us is it gives us some relief on the cost side. We are getting crushed. And the numbers don't get, and the other challenge we have as a tax credit in the tax credit world is you set the numbers a year and a half before you start construction. And if the costs are still going up, then now I've got a hole before I start. So let me address this. On a typical tax credit deal, I try very hard not to defer fee because that's my only buffer. And when I get to the closing table and my GC gives me a construction cost number that is higher than the number I predicted 2 years ago, the only way I can keep that deal doable is I say, okay, defer $300,000, let's close. And let's move forward. If I start out with a deferred fee of $500,000, when we get 2 years down the road, now the deal is broken, right? So I have to preserve as much buffer wherever I can because that's my source of last resort to fix the deal and move forward. But some people think that that's the way to get the developer to put more skin in the game. I've already got skin in the game. I gotta close and get it to completion. Investor return expectations are, help me on time. We okay? Okay. Market rate investor return expectations in the real estate industry are 17 to 20% on a 3 to 5 year IRR. That is the norm. And developers, as I mentioned, because we're building units that are using conventional equity, that are incentivizing us to beat their return expectations, you really have to design a development that exceeds that hurdle, okay? So I'm gonna talk a little bit about those sources of financing. On an affordable and mixed income deal, we typically have a very complex capital stack, at least 3 sources. We're gonna use typically tax credit equity, conventional debt, or if it's a bond deal, tax exempt debt, and some type of subsidy financing, but usually the subsidy is more than one source. We might have a loan from the housing authority, we might have a loan from the city, we have something else, something else, something else. So our closing and our financing structure is actually more complicated than a market rate deal. Even on the conventional side where we're doing workforce housing, it is usually a little less complex, but our private equity probably needs to be social or long-term equity because we can't deliver the 20% return that the market rate real estate investor is expecting. On the market rate side, they generally have 2 sources. It's a clean deal, market rate private equity, and conventional debt. But the key is the investor's expectations. So part of solving this problem, and what Deborah and I have talked about, is how do you bring more capital into this marketplace that might support some of your objectives? Because I think that is one of the key components. So here are a few examples. The retreat, for those of you who came to Charlotte, is the Renaissance development, is the last Hope 6 deal in the Charlotte community. We developed it with the Charlotte Housing Authority. It is the senior component, 110 units at ranging from 30% AMI to 60% AMI. The residences is the family component of that, 224 units. They range from 30% AMI up to market rate. And when we combine those two components, which is really 3 separate transactions, I started the Renaissance in 2007. We finished it in 2016. So a long journey. I'm sure you're experiencing that with your public housing redevelopment. But because we did sequential development phases, it was a very long development. The total development cost for the housing alone is $57 million. We had $24 million of tax credit equity, $14 million of subsidy from the housing authority, $12 million of subsidy from the city, $6 million of perm debt, and $1 million of a loan from the NCHFA. 5 different sources, 3 different phases. It was a journey. I think the outcome is superb. I'm very, very proud of it. I think we serve households across the spectrum. This community includes an educational component. It's built on the purpose-built communities model, so it has a very holistic perspective around family self-sufficiency and what it means to break intergenerational poverty. We have a nonprofit partner called Renaissance West Community Initiative, which owns the component of supporting families. They partnered with the school system to build a new pre-K-8 school that is modeled on the Drew Charter School at Eastlake in Atlanta. They raised the money to open a child development center that the YMCA of Greater Charlotte operates on their behalf. But they own the piece of thinking about how to bring the supportive services. As a developer, we were the residential developer partner that thought about that execution, but then everybody else had to have skin in the game in order to make that work. 757 North was our first workforce housing deal. It is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. It was a parcel owned by a local CDC. The CDC had land control on an adjacent parcel from the city of Winston-Salem. They had tried tax credit deals a couple of times and were not successful. We came to them with a concept that said, we will build basically market rate units and make a percentage of them deed restricted at 80% AMI. It has, it's a $15.5 million deal, 115 units on barely 2 acres, tight parking, 1 per unit. We had 3 sources of financing, $4 million of, this deal was our first deal. We did this with a conventional real estate private equity partner who wanted a 17% return, which we did not hit. And we raised the $4 million of private equity. We did a $10 million construction loan, which we guaranteed, and we had $1.5 million from the city of Winston-Salem. I consider it a success, even though the investor wanted to sell it and they didn't hit their return hurdle. What I learned in that was we had the wrong investor, right? They weren't mission aligned. I could barely finish the building before they were asking me what the cap rate was and how much they were gonna make on flipping it. That's not our DNA. Our DNA is much more stabilize it, let's get it leased. Is everything working the way it's supposed to? Now let's think about what's next. So I believe that workforce and middle income housing is a need. It can be developed, but there needs to be a more modest return expectation on that product. But frankly, that equity is very hard to find. Maybe in some states it's a little bit more prevalent, but here it is not.
You mean, when you say that equity, you mean investors that are mission-driven investors?
Correct.
Right.
That have a lower return
Yeah,
expectation.
Right.
And who are these folks? I mean, are they, like, when you talk about that, I mean, these are entities, these are small entities, these are, tell us a little about who these.
So what's working for us now is we have one family office who is DC-based. They are long-term hold. They don't try to flip their deals. They hold them for 20 years. They care about cash-on-cash return. But because they're a long-term hold, they're still market. But the pressure to create this internal rate of return hurdle is eased, and we can make the numbers work a little bit better, right? But it's still difficult to get very deep affordability into the deal with them as the investor without a layer of subsidy. But they also have, as a company, they have their family office invest in real estate to support education. So when you really.
So when she says family office, she means this is a family that has a large,
high net
a lot of
worth,
money,
yes.
and they've made
private.
yeah, it's like the Levines in Charlotte.
Correct,
That
correct.
have made a decision to
Correct.
invest in.
And so, but because they have a philanthropic, they use their profitability from real estate to fund some philanthropic endeavors of their own. I approached them because I felt like they could get our DNA. And they are not spooked by the affordability piece. That's one example. Avion Point, I'll use that as the other example. This is, anybody who knows where the old Charlotte Hornets used to play in Charlotte, is a parcel across the street from the old Charlotte Hornets Coliseum. It was city-owned land. And so we helped the city really flesh out their surplus land policy. Somehow we saw the surplus land list and we were like, that's actually a good piece of dirt. And we approached the city to say, can we use that for affordable housing? Now, Deborah won't tell you how crazy it was at the time, but this is interesting, right? Because you have real estate and community development working together on this issue. At the time, real estate couldn't figure out how to transact the land for less than market value, because that's not what we do. We sell land for market value. So we went to the real estate department, had one conversation, and then we went to the housing department, had a different conversation. So we made a market price offer to the city of Charlotte for its land and turned around and borrowed the subsidy from the Housing Trust Fund to pay the city of Charlotte.
Okay, at least we're.
That's crazy.
Am I exaggerating? But at some point, it wasn't worth the brain damage to try to get the real estate at less than market value.
I was in planning, I was not.
Not in charge. So this is a total, there's 2 components to this deal. We've used this parcel, I'm sorry, I'm not doing good with my slides here. We've used this parcel to do 200 units in total. 80 of them, we did a senior tax credit deal, but we combined that with 120 workforce housing units. So we're going from 80% AMI up to market. 51% of the units are at 80% AMI and below.
Are they
which
in
is-
separate, are they blended units throughout the project, or were they separate?
No, we have a
buildings?
senior building.
Okay.
And then we have, it's kind of suburban garden style, clubhouse, breezeway buildings for the non-age restricted component. We did close them simultaneously. We used a HUD 221 D4. So we closed both, they're separate projects, but they're built as though they're one community. We closed it simultaneously. We have it's $33.6 million total. 3.4 million of tax credit equity, 2.5 million of social private equity, 21.8 million in two HUD 221 D4 loans, which we closed a week before the government shut down. And a $5.6 million subsidy from the city of Charlotte, 1.2 million of which went to pay themselves, and a few $100,000 worth of deferred fee. But that's where you get to the policy point. There was no surplus land policy. So real estate did what real estate did, and housing did what they were able to do, and so we just worked it out. It was easier to do it that way. Now, I would argue we burned housing trust fund money when we didn't have to use that cash in that way, but the city council also has the authority to move the land sale money back into the housing trust fund. But in Charlotte, land sale dollars go to the general fund, not to the housing trust fund. So the proceeds of the 1.2 went to the general fund, and we borrowed 5.6 from the housing trust fund. But this deal worked because we had an investor that was willing to take a 6% return. And that is a Charlotte-based investor who wants to, they have exited the development business, they made a lot of money over the years, and they have said that they want to use the wealth they created, and one of their tranches of mission is workforce housing, and they are willing to do that in their market area for a lesser return. So when I combine the lower return from the equity investor with the subsidy for the city, that's how we got to 51% at 80. And we could have mixed that differently, but that was our concept there. Last one I'll share with you is just a pure middle income seniors. This really is much more like a market deal. But we have identified that I believe that the age restricted population, the senior population, even in the middle, is really struggling with housing options. And we structured this completely conventionally. We made a private land purchase. There's no subsidy in this deal, but our rents are between 80 and 120. It's a $16.6 million development, 6.6 million of private equity, and a $10 million conventional construction loan.
What percentage do you think is at the 80% level?
I would probably say 20 to 30%,
Okay.
but
And
it's also not deed restricted.
And so you don't have a promise in terms of the number of years you're gonna deliver
Correct.
at that level?
In this deal, we did this because this is what we do.
And
Right.
and the rate of return on this is less than what you would see out in the market?
Slightly. We leverage the family office here, which is a longer term investment. We're meeting their cash on cash return expectations. So it is not as aggressive as the prior real estate private equity investor I had, but it's also not where the social equity investor is either.
So somewhere in the
So
middle?
they're in the middle.
So, and I ask that because, we get, well, we haven't lately because the apartment boom seems to be slowing a bit. But we've had private developers who are purchasing land, not a city deal, come to us, and we have this big debate about what percentage, we want to require all of them to build in some percentage of affordability into their project. And we do, and it varies. But there's always this big debate about, well, we think you can afford to do more units than you're saying you can. It's not clear to me that any of these developers here have the, family office investment or any of those. They're just going out and getting conventional financing or
Correct.
investment.
Correct.
So, what is a reasonable expectation of a developer who's building an apartment building in Asheville if it's just straight up traditional? How much should we be able to say we think you can afford to provide an affordable units? And when we say affordable in that context, it's the 80%
Okay.
AMI.
don't know that I have a specific target. My general answer would be, without subsidy, I think the number's 10% or less. Without subsidy.
Yeah.
And that aligns with what you see in inclusionary zoning problems. Honestly, I think you'd get 5 to 8%. I think Crescent did 8% in the River District, something of that nature. But let me give you a specific example.
And when you say 10%, you're saying 10% at 80%.
Yes,
You're not saying 10% at
60 or
okay.
below. Yes, ma'am.
So, I mean, that's,
Yes.
it's, okay.
I almost fell out of my chair when I saw y'all's 20% at 60.
Well, so do the
So do
applicants.
so do the developers.
Right? And I want to do the work, right? My reaction isn't that I don't want to do the work or I'm spooked by the affordable component.
too
I
risky.
can't intuit.
Can't
I
make
mean,
the
when you do
numbers
this enough, you can intuitively start looking at requests and numbers and say, that's not going to work, right? So I wanted to share math.
But
Okay.
we're gonna push 20.
We're gonna push them back in their
We're
chair.
just gonna push.
Get your checkbook out, Miss City Manager.
No, I do think that's an
I
important
think
point.
that's
If
it.
we're expecting 60% of
We're gonna
AMI,
have
we
to
are
pay
going
for
to
it.
have to pony up
That's right.
a subsidy in
That's right.
order to make that happen.
That's right. So I just tried to use my own template model to kind of do some math, right? And so right now, this is total development cost of $165,000. That's kind of what we're spending today in our markets to build.
This is
For
a per
one
unit.
unit.
One unit.
Yeah.
Total development cost of $165,000 a unit, okay? This is a 30% equity investment. Again, this is my world, so it's not structured parking, it's a smaller deal.
So just to translate a little bit, you're talking about multifamily housing here. This is not single-family homes.
Correct.
And when you say 30% equity investment, that's the cash in the deal.
Correct.
Cash in the deal so that you're not, not the financing piece of it.
Cash of equity that had to be invested. I had to go get additional cash from the bank, but that's a pure bank loan. But a bank is gonna have a threshold up to
They
which
want your money.
they want to loan, and then we have to go raise equity. Typically, that is not the developer's money. Typically, an equity investment is structured 90% from fundraising in the market and 10% or less of our money. Okay? So if this is a $15 million.
I think you need to go back one slide.
Sorry.
So it's cash from other investors.
Correct,
Yeah.
that I have to
you.
raise in order to make this deal work. And they're gonna ask me for 17 to 20% return on their money. So to get this deal to deliver a 20 to the investor, I had to have my rents, my one bedrooms had to be at 1,200, my two bedrooms had to be at 1,600. So what I was seeing when I was just playing with my own model was intuitively, the market rents are where they are because that's where they have to be in order to meet the investor's return expectations in the current marketplace, right? And this isn't even the most complicated deal. If I were building a true market rate development, my costs are gonna be more than $165,000 because I'm gonna build a $20,000 structured parking deck, $20,000 per space,
Yeah.
right? So my costs are gonna be that much higher, right? Now granted, you're building a bigger development, you can spread it across more units and so forth. I tried not to make my analysis too complicated, right? So I took our model, said, where are we normally? What would my rents have to be in order to hit a 20? I backed into the 20. I was trying to hit a 20. Then I took the same spreadsheet and I made 20% of my units 60% AMI. And two things happened. One, I couldn't even get the same bank loan because the bank loan is structured based on the amount of cash flow. I have to have a certain debt coverage ratio. So now my cash has fallen to the point that now I actually have to go raise more equity. So I had to add $1.2 million worth of equity to the deal because my bank loan shrunk, and I could only hit an 8% return on that equity. I don't know where to go get that money. This does not meet my family office hurdle. This does meet the social equity hurdle, but this money is almost non-existent in the marketplace. Now granted, there's no subsidy in it, But that's where I'm saying, and then I did it with another version that had 20% at 60 and 20% at 80, and it just broke, right? Literally, like the return was negative.
Yeah.
So I stopped here and paused and said, okay, this is the dilemma, right? I have to have something that is going to offset this math or some combination of sources in order to make this work. And so in my examples, again, I left the tax credit world aside because I think what you're really trying to do, the tax credit world, if you're willing to do 9% and you're willing to write subsidy checks for 4% from time to time or on some level of consistent basis, those deals will happen. I think what you're trying to figure out is how do you get affordable units out of a more conventional development structure. And this is, to your point, you have to have a layer of subsidy in order to make the math work. And so what types of subsidies could work? You could have low-interest loans or grants. And I think when I played with that last scenario and I tried to get it back to a 20, I should have written this number down. I put in like $2.5 million of subsidy at no interest to the city.
We were very generous.
And I kind of got back.
The hypothetical.
Right, but if you add interest, all you're doing is writing a bigger check.
But the per unit subsidy then for the affordable units,
In my scenario, I only had 118 units, so it was
Right, so-
24 units at 60.
so that's a significant per
It was a
unit
significant
subsidy.
subsidy.
I mean, that, and you know, and I think that really hits on this fundamental question. You know, I always say you can't buy yourself out of an affordable housing crisis, which clearly you can't, because if you can only turn, 22 units, 23 units in one project with a $2.5 million subsidy, I mean, the per unit subsidy is,
It's
we've
just
got to do
significant.
it. We have to include this piece in all that we do, and we do have low interest loans and grants, but I think when people are sort of clamoring for government to play a bigger role in affordable housing, one of the realities of it is the subsidy level is so
We need more money.
significant, and those are taxpayer dollars.
Correct.
We're talking about a city subsidy.
And you're making a trade-off, right? Those are dollars that you're not using to meet some other public benefit. I
Right.
get that, right?
Well,
Roads, other things that you're responsible for.
Well, and the other frustrating thing is, for us to be putting in a significant amount of taxpayer dollars, but there's some, investor in New York City, I'm just making that up, who's gonna make 20%. He or she or they or whoever are not, they're not taking a bite to help us meet our needs. And that, they don't care about our needs. They don't care about the struggles around affordability in Asheville. And I guess that's,
In the country.
I get it.
We need a
Yeah.
separate work session on ethics and morality.
I mean, it's
but
just
you're- but
seriously,
you're-
putting taxpayer dollars on the table so that a distant investor can make their expectations, it just doesn't feel right.
But I think
that
what your
way.
point is that the number of investors out there with, this social
Social.
goal,
I-
these social goals
I get it.
is limited, and what can you, other than convincing people that they should just do this?
Out of the goodness
Well,
of their
meet
heart.
their
I mean,
social-
Yes.
and I think just, stepping back a little bit, it's like, well, that's what investors do. And so, we don't ask other people who, invest in the stock market and, it's just,
'Cause they're not
that's how
solving a
they
problem.
play. I know, but they don't think of it as solving a problem.
No, they're just,
I mean,
they're just comparing
They're comparing
investments and
how
rates
much
of
can they
return.
make here versus how much can they make there.
And the risk associated. So let's remember, real estate is one of the
Right.
riskiest businesses you could be in, right? And so the market has driven some expectation of return related to that risk. I do think that the story for a lower return equity is one that is, I make the case that it's not lower return, it's risk-adjusted return, because I make the case all the time that our deals are less risky
That's right.
than a market rate deal. But then we have to raise that equity, and we can talk about this, but, Charlotte made a big push this year to get private dollars on the table, and have formed an investment fund.
That's what I was
Right?
wondering.
And it has everything from corporate dollars in it to philanthropic dollars in it. et cetera, that is requiring a lower return. And we're gonna do one of the first of those deals. They hired LISC or brought LISC in, which is the Local Initiative Support Corporation. They're a CDFI, they're national, to run the fund, to manage the fund, but the dollars are private sector dollars. And that is one approach. I do think the social investment community is growing, but it's not really mature at the level that we would need it. So I look for those dollars where I can, but I'm frankly stumbling on it. I will say that I'm actually committing to, I'm gonna actually try to raise a dedicated Laurel Street fund that lets us do more of this. But that means then I'm gonna try to chase these dollars and raise our own fund to try to do this work, but it's
So-
hard to find.
So for the community fund in Charlotte, what is the rate of return? Is there, I assume it's not promised, but, benchmarked?
I think they promised a 2 to 3% return.
So very low.
And so what they're doing in those deals is we have no tax credit equity. The deal we propose is in downtown Charlotte, 100 units. It goes from 30% AMI to market, stepped all the way up. We have a tranche of City Housing Trust Fund and a tranche from what they're calling the Charlotte Housing Opportunity Investment Fund, and conventional debt.
And is there some tax benefit to people who contribute to this fund or some other than just the social?
Not that I'm aware of.
Return? Okay, so one more, I listened to a panel on affordable housing by mayors across the country about a year and a half ago, and in Austin, they are trying to create, and I don't know how far they've gotten, the same kind of investment concept, but theirs is on what you talked about at the beginning of this. Preservation.
So social money likes preservation better than new construction.
Well, it's a known quantity.
Most social or lower return social investment funds in the country. Enterprise has one, Austin's doing it. I can think of a few others, but they're actually trying to buy existing housing deals, right? Which is a great source if you're trying to, again, preserve your old stock, but it is not adding units to the market. So those funds, one of the ways I think they convince themselves to take the lower hurdle is they take out the construction risk.
Right.
Right? And so they want to say, we want to buy it when it's finished. I believe this is doable. It takes some work. We have to help create this market. It is not a sophisticated, robust market today. But I think we also have to think about every tool. You can't have one tool in the toolbox. You really have to use every tool in the toolbox. So I say low interest loans or grants. I say free or low cost land. I'm not necessarily saying all from the city of Asheville, right? In my experience, the biggest landowner in the market is probably county, not the city. Is that true here?
Well, we have some really well-placed land that we're looking
Sure.
at developing. Yeah.
Right, that would be valuable, but
The county does have
who else owns land, is all I'm saying, right? Property tax grants. So we cannot do property tax abatement, similar to inclusionary zoning. You can't do property tax abatement by state law. But you could give me a grant agreement
And we do.
Yeah.
at the city. But the entity that gets the biggest tax
Is the
check
county.
is actually the county. If you were to combine those two and have a combined grant, that math, because we've done that math, meaningfully offsets a cash subsidy. Because that's bankable. I can go to the bank and say, oh, my operating expenses just dropped by this percentage. Can I get more bank debt instead of having to pay this bill? But I have to have a grant agreement. I would say waive fees or requirements. This starts to get more residual, right? But if you really look at that $165,000 of total development costs, a nice little chunk of them get written to public entities. Expedited approvals. So if we know your policy and we're complying with your policy, what can you do to speed us along? What can we do to move forward? Could we, I'm gonna be wild and crazy here, could we agree to comply with your policy and get something by right as opposed to by conditional approval?
So, that is an important point, I think, and one that would really make a difference for our community. How do we, and this may be rhetorical, but how do we make sure that the affordability component will
be present in the project if it bypasses, it doesn't have to go to city council for review, it just has all the built-in requirements and hits the road. How do we,
I think that's called inclusionary zoning.
well, but I'm wondering if there's another way to skin that cat, if you could tie it to, that's such a terrible phrase, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I don't know if there's another way to do that. If it was tied to if it was using our land, or if it was tied to one of our loans or grants, if it was one of those that we could carve out a special way for
I
those
think that
to
is
work.
doable.
Yes.
I think there's a technical way to do that without the process.
Yeah.
And while
Through the permitting process. We can do it. I think Charlotte does it, has density bonuses where by right, you can do up to, say, a quadruplex in a single-family district, and get a bonus. You
But
don't
you're
have to
talking
go
about
through
large
a
scale
rezoning.
too, though, I mean,
They have a multifamily
so
density bonus.
that'll be the after
program as
lunch
well.
part, but yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Mhm. And we're gonna talk about the regulatory process.
But those things all add value, both in terms of process and time and certainty. And to your point of attracting developers, if people know with certainty what they can do and how to do it, I think it makes it a more attractive place to do work.
Just one other question I had, going back to the question of the investor return. We're sort of in year 8, right, of an economic boom. And so I'm wondering, in terms of that 20%, did you see a difference in during a recessionary period? So in terms of talking about time limits, we're probably right now, as we saw from Nikki's slides, almost at the top of the market, so to speak. We're very much close to that. Would you expect to see, given that you're in this world and you were in the pure private world before, any differences if we'd be in a recession? What typically happens in that case as it relates to the return?
I mean, the true answer is, I don't know. When we were in the last recession, we were mostly doing tax credit deals. That was all that was really moving forward, to be honest. In some respects, a lot of investors exited real estate during the recession. They just pulled back altogether. And if you could get the investor equity, you couldn't get the bank money, right? Because the banks were spooked of real estate. So we really struggled to get a construction loan during the recession because they were too real estate heavy. They had too much in that space. And so I don't know that I think it will give us the reprieve. I also don't know that when we were in the last recession, again, this is a new space. We're on our 4th transaction, and Laurel Street's the only developer I know who's really trying to do this as an active piece of our platform. Our go-forward pipeline will be half tax credit and half workforce housing. But that's the other value for me of being a private sector for-profit developer. I don't report to a board. So if it makes sense on my little spreadsheet, we can go do it.
In a recession, arguably, what's going to happen is that your ability to get a better rate of return someplace else is going to be low, right? So part of the reason you're at 20% too is opportunity
Is the
cost,
market.
right, to go someplace
Right.
else. So in a recession, if you are able to get a guaranteed rate of 4%, 5%, 6%, then some of these entities out there, my hope would be, and again, not knowing that, but the economists would say more money would be going towards this area.
I think there are 2 different investor pools. I think the pool that we're talking about that we need is one we have to build that has a triple bottom line expectation, one that includes some philanthropic dollars, one that includes some invested corporate partners who have something to gain from seeing Asheville be successful. I think it's a different pool of investors, and their rationale as to why they're in, why they're willing to accept this return, and why they're willing to stay is gonna be totally different than the traditional real estate investor.
That's what I really want to hear, because maybe I'm living in a fantasy world. I'm hearing the hard numbers and I'm trying to live in the reality, but I don't really see anybody around Asheville having these conversations and hosting conversations around being a social investor. Since we love Asheville so much, I don't see these conversations being convened.
Well,
mean, like
but
from
I
the
mean, you've
investment
got,
community?
From the investment
but
community, yes.
SECU,
State
when-
Employees Credit Union.
yeah, when you invest with them, there's things you can,
But we don't have a big,
Not anything
heavy hitter
big,
like
but-
the Levines. Now, we do have a new entity, the Dogwood endowment. And that is not up and rolling yet, but that will be the largest per capita endowment apparently in the nation, $1.5 billion to serve Western North Carolina. And their mission is to address social determinants of health, which does include housing. So I do think we don't really know how that'll play out, but there may be a new opportunity for us that's unique to our area.
Well,
And the reality that didn't exist in most places. You mentioned Texas. Austin's was a cobble together from some real estate leaders who decided that they wanted to do this work and wanted to serve on the fund, create this fund. And that was a few years ago, and I think they're just getting real traction. The Charlotte piece is just getting real traction, and that was after Charlotte got, frankly, embarrassed. I have to go home, so I have to be careful. Unless y'all gonna let me move, right?
nope, door's closed.
50 out of 50 in terms of the top cities where you could move from low economic, being in poverty to having real economic opportunity. Then they launched this big effort to say, how can we have more economic mobility? And one of the ideas was, one, to increase the Housing Trust Fund, and then two was this potential fund, right? We asked the Terwilliger Center at ULI to come to Charlotte and look at the affordable housing issue. We brought 3 or 4 or 5 different experts to the table to look specifically at what was going on in Charlotte. One of the ideas was a fund. So it's a grassroots kind of thing, and so I don't think that opportunity is lost to you, and I don't think you're starting from a different place than everybody else has on this topic.
I wonder if there's a way, because just going to other communities and talking to other leaders in other cities, it does seem like larger cities especially tend to have this private investment community that's really invested in their city and, determined to build the children's hospital or determined to build the whatever museum. And we are lacking for that, quite frankly. We're just not, I don't know if it's our size that we're really, we're not as big as a Charlotte. We're not as big as an Atlanta. Is there a way to assess our capacity for that? I mean, do we truly have the capacity right here in Asheville to create a private investment fund that would be driven by some social cause to invest in housing? Or is that just, anecdotally sounds good, but we don't truly have the numbers here? I don't know. I don't know.
The conversation has started. It has started.
No, I know the conversation has started. I'm just saying, is there a way to actually analyze this to see if there, more than a conversation, if it could be a meaningful thing for our
Yeah, no, I mean, the conversation has started to see if it can be a meaningful thing. The conversation has started here in the context of opportunity zones and whether the city could create a local opportunity fund that local investors would invest in and be willing to take this lower return. I mean, that's just the framework that we've started it in. I think it's great that other cities are doing it even outside of that context. And I mean, we're just at the beginning of that conversation, but it is happening, and investors are at that table.
Yeah, and my
and
question
people
is
are-
more, is there a way to evaluate, whether we have that capacity in existence here?
Or there's a capacity, it's a question of how big is it?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
is it
Is it something we
200,000
really
or is
should
it
spend time and
200
effort
million?
on, and it could be significant, or
Funny you should
I think the
ask.
answer is yes.
funny?
As part of staff's recommendation toward the end of this session, as a convener and collaborator, which we think we didn't have that role earlier, we are recommending that council assume this role, but we're also suggesting that we pursue looking into creating that type of fund. So we'll have an opportunity after lunch.
With that being said, I'd like to jump in because I haven't spoken in here today. Just to kind of piggyback off of that, but before I do, go into the dynamic as I see it, how the city of Asheville works with developers on affordable housing. The developers to me, there seems to be 2 different streams of developers that come to the city for affordable housing. There's the developer that comes not through Housing and Community Development Committee, which is chaired by Councilwoman Mayfield, and myself sits on it with Councilwoman Smith. But the developer who comes through, such as a developer which wanted to develop the old Sears property. They didn't come through and say we wanted to really do and partner with the city of Asheville on affordable housing. they kind of came to us through a different process. And once they got to the council, there were some of those 11th hour type things asked of that developer. I think a scenario that was given a little bit earlier by the mayor was a developer who did $650,000 to our housing trust fund. I think it needs to be noted as well, but that developer was a hotel developer and not necessarily an affordable housing developer. So when you talk about developers that actually want to partner with the city to do real deal affordable housing, they kind of come to the city through a housing and community development department and committee process that says, we really want to do this. This is part of our mission, or we are a for-profit developer that just wants to do affordable housing. When they do come through that process, based on the time that I've been on Housing and Community Development Committee, we've virtually bent over backwards and approved almost everything that I don't think we've disapproved almost anything that's come to us. Matter of fact, I think we've had projects come back to us 2 and 3 and 4 times where we've tried to make things work. And based on, by the way, thank you, Ms. Nelson, for coming and speaking. You've given us a lot of good information. Based on some of the things that you've told us, I don't think it's the city's capacity to not want to provide affordable housing, because we've definitely done that with the $25 million in bond money that we've put toward affordable housing, plus the millions that we've dumped into our housing trust fund. We see that being used currently right now by developers as we looked at our last balance sheet in our housing and community development meeting, and it was in the red, meaning we've given away almost all of our money toward affordable housing. And so when you come and you speak and you say things that what's your developer priorities, that brings a little bit of light to how we can kind of help out and put more tools in our toolbox. You mentioned making a reasonable return as allowed by partners and investors, minimizing risk on your projects. And so the way that I see it, it seems as though that you talked about, the assumed risks and what you do. And one of those large parts of the assumed risk you mentioned was your pursuit cost. The identify possible projects, and you say you put in at least $100,000 in that. And your pre-development cost, which was upwards of well over $500,000. In my mind, I'm thinking to myself, maybe you could talk to us a little bit more about the risk specifically as it pertains to pursuit cost, pre-development cost, and what, if any, public dollars could do for your business. And beyond that, would that help alleviate some of the issues as a municipality partnering with a developer when they come in on the front side and say, look, we've eyed a piece of property that the city has and we want to develop this, but we want to also talk to you about our pursuit costs and our pre-development costs. And then when we start talking about, I think there was a conversation that was going on over here about what Charlotte has just done with private investors. At one of our HCD meetings, I asked about our ability to leverage our LOBs and SOBs for money toward affordable housing, and I'm one of the few that believe that government can do more, and we probably should be doing more as it pertains to the very lower end of the income structure. And based on what you've said about, most of your money is made off of development fees, how can we alleviate some of that risk? I do know that if we put in, let's say, I think there was a guy that came to HCD and I asked him about his project cost, how much a total project cost for him. And I don't know if you remember, Julie, it was, I want to say the old Mountainside project. The developer said that project ran about $12 million in total. So if we were to invest $1.2 million in LOBs and SOBs, we could essentially get back $12 million. So you start thinking about, I'm not talking about putting that on a whole project, but I'm talking about also do the private stuff where you get people to invest to raise that sort of capital. But if the city could put in that type of money, $1 million and get $10 million, how far would that money go in helping developers mitigate risk as it pertains to pursuit costs, pre-development costs, guarantee of construction, all of those things that a developer takes on the front end, and then when they get to the very end of it, they're trying to figure out, okay, will this work? You talked about you ate some cost in some project where you had to pretty much
Right off our feet.
Yeah. So what is it that the city can do on that end to help? And how far will that go in bringing in more developers? Because I don't think we have a problem with bringing developers in. We're in the red. I mean, technically speaking, I know there are some numbers that have to be pumped in there, but we've given away tons of money and when people really want to partner with the city of Asheville, we bend over backwards to try to help them get these projects up. I can't think of one project that we haven't passed in housing and community development.
I mean, my short answer would be, I appreciate your question and your consideration. Usually, we don't have people who are worried about our risk or the pain point on our side, but at the end of the day, those are also factors as to why you make the decision to work in one place versus another. There are places, North Carolina is not very sophisticated in this regard with respect to supporting developers in the pursuit of affordable housing. But we've looked hard at developing in New York, and there are pre-development funds, right? So there are loan funds that you could draw down. You could potentially make it possible, if you have an early commitment of housing trust fund, can we draw on that housing trust? Can we draw up to X dollar amount on a housing trust fund loan early, which buys us the time and the flexibility to work with you on some of those special requests or things that you need. It's the exposure that creates the pain point of not knowing kind of where you're gonna end up. And not necessarily in making a bigger investment in the project, but potentially how you disperse that money to the developer. Typically, housing trust fund dollars aren't dispersed. You've made a commitment, but we've got to get all the way to the closing table, right? And so we're carrying that upfront piece. Could you have, some tax credit syndicators, for example, do that? They allow us to pre-close on a few $100,000 worth of equity early. Could that be possible as well? But that would be my short answer.
Let me ask you this. So would it essentially, and I'm trying to simplify because I know I went on a long ramble there, but to simplify, as it pertains to your pursuit costs and pre-development costs, is there any benefit from a local government helping mitigate that risk for you up front and doing some things on the back end? Not saying that we would have that money come out of a housing trust fund. Maybe we set up something different for pre-development costs. But is there any sort of benefit to you as a developer if we say, we're going to assume some of the risk with you because we really believe that these sorts of projects are critical to the development of our community, and we want to help with the pre-development costs, as well as, since you're working with us, we have other products that we offer, such as our land use incentive grants, such as our waiver of fees, such as our housing trust fund. We're going to assume some of the risk with you because we believe in the project.
So, yes, but if I were to rank what I think will have the greatest relief for the developer and the greatest benefit for the city, I'm brainstorming here, so this is not fully fleshed out, is the city could use, for example, some of its capital to work with a bank to create some type of backstop guarantee fund. So we spent a lot of time talking about how to get the equity return down. What could you do to get a bank to say, I'll lend at a lower interest rate?
So with that being said, there was a question that I asked several months ago, and hopefully I'll get the answer to it at some point in time. How can we leverage LOBs and SOBs, putting in that 1 million to get 10, to do the exact same thing that Ms. Nelson is talking about? And I don't know if anybody here has that answer, and maybe that's a finance question, but I'm still looking for that, and hopefully I can get that at some point in
Is
time.
the question essentially like, how do we borrow? It's essentially the question.
How do we
like,
use borrowed money?
Yeah, how do we borrow to do this? Is that kind of?
That's correct.
Borrow and become essentially an equity investor.
Exactly.
And I'm suggesting you don't necessarily have to be a true equity investor,
Just
but
a
there might be
guarantor.
other financial structures you could help put in place that actually lower the cost of the execution. We've done 2 deals that used a HUD 221D4. And the HUD program requires a operating reserve. I think between the 2 projects, I think for us, it was $1.2 million of operating reserve. Operating reserve. You give them cash, it sits in an account for 3 years. So we were struggling to say, are we really gonna pay private equity return on some money that's sitting in a reserve account? So we went to a CDFI, which was the North Carolina initiative, and we borrowed on our own balance sheet the money for the reserves. And the project pays the interest expense, and you can monitor whether the reserve is still sitting there. But for example, if you were to say, we will fund the reserves. You do that's lowering the cost and the risk. There are creative ways that you might be able to put money in some pots. That's not actually an expenditure, right? That's a backstop. That's a city guarantee behind something. You might not want to use your true bond rating to do it, but you could use a bucket of money.
Yeah,
And you become investors.
yeah, I mean, that's something we'd have to decide.
Correct.
You know, there have been
Correct.
instances where the city's investment has failed and the money's been lost because the project wasn't completed.
But this is essentially the same model as the community capital fund, right?
Except it's
That
not.
we just, not at nearly the same levels.
No,
but it's
that's
the same-
private, but that's private investment money. Here, we're talking about the city being the guarantor.
No, but I think, well, no, I mean, essentially, that is the model for the community capital fund, that if the bank lends money to me to start a business and it fails and I can't pay the bank back, what we've said is, for certain people, we'll backstop that loan. So that's, I
Yeah,
think,
like
that's what I hear
$500,000.
you,
I'm totally confused. I thought you were talking about where private individuals invest in a fund that.
no, I mean, that is a different thing, but
What
the
are you
model
talking
that you're
about?
talking about, of where if the city could backstop.
Oh, you're talking about our small business loan?
Yeah.
Okay,
Isn't
I'm sorry. I
that
didn't
community
understand
capital
you were
fund?
talking about
And I'm
that,
saying
yeah.
something like that, where
Right.
it's not the city's full unlimited guarantee.
Right.
It is a bucket of money. You
Yeah.
let's put $1 million in this bucket and let's use it, and then how much would that leverage? But I think the key there is negotiating with partners to figure out how would that improve the terms on certain affordable housing deals?
But one question, in terms of the economics of this, so there's an equation, right? You have a spreadsheet, and it's got all these different things that you gotta plug in and do it. You know, if we had $1, right, to spend, right, to give you the best chance as an affordable housing developer to get a project done, is it on the front end with the cost? So for example, is it the free low-cost land, aspect in that, if you reduce the cost up front of the actual purchase, right, or outlay, that's gonna reduce your outlay, it's gonna reduce how much you have to borrow, it's gonna reduce all these sorts of things versus something more on the back end, right, like $1 in the operating reserve, for example. So if we were to rank these things, right, and I realize we're gonna get to this later this afternoon, I'm sorry for jumping ahead, and you don't have to answer this now, but helping us kind of understand, just like you guys prioritized the 1 through 4 earlier, is there something here that we said we had a limited amount of dollars, biggest bang for your buck as an affordable housing developer, if you were to look at those sorts of things, where you would essentially prioritize?
So my top 3 on this list, not in order,
Sure.
would be low interest loan or grant, free low cost land, property tax grant, and social investor equity will be my top 4. I said 3.
Yeah.
I know, we're all like. Okay. And after lunch or something, are we gonna go through, I mean, just for reminding council, but also the public, what programs we have in place, and talk a little bit about what we feel like's been successful versus not? Okay, I figured you would, but.
I will end, I think I'm over time. I've enjoyed this conversation though, and I appreciate your engaged dialogue. To remind you that you can't do it by yourself, right? If you try, you will have impact, and it will be valued impact. But what I hear in your aspiration and the enthusiasm in this conversation is much bigger than that. And if other partners could participate with you, the county, the school system, there's been a lot of conversation about building affordable housing near schools. Most school systems buy more land than they need because they have large school footprints. How do you use some of that residual land to support affordable housing development? Your nonprofit community, which is heavily around supportive services and all the things that are necessary to help families. Because affordable housing isn't just a housing problem, it's an income problem. Right? If you're really trying to build housing at 30% AMI, but for the HUD subsidies and Section 8 and so forth, housing choice vouchers, et cetera, it's almost impossible. But how do you get a 30% AMI household to a 50% AMI household? Right? That's the other piece of the puzzle. Corporations, we talked about that, the investor community, but I think you need a little bit of everything from everyone in order to get to the finish line. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
It's really good.
So,
Okay.
we are ready
We're
for-
at that part on here that says lunch break, but we're gonna have a working lunch, so do you wanna take till 11:30 to,
yeah,
before we
we'll
reconvene?
Yeah, give
Okay.
people just an opportunity
And
to
then-
just break for a minute.
Lunch is set up in that room over there behind the curtain, and it is available for the folks at this table and staff as well? Okay.
Yes.
All right, everyone, try to go grab some lunch. Break.
We have more.